On the morning of March 12, 1944, an American military policeman named Corporal James Dowd walked into Barracks 3B at Camp Papago Park, Arizona, at approximately 0610 hours to conduct the standard morning head count. The desert air outside was still cold. The sky above the Sonoran scrubland had barely begun to lighten, a thin gray wash spreading east over the mountains. Cactus wrens had started their noise in the Ocotillo thickets beyond the perimeter fence. Everything looked the way it always looked. Quiet. Controlled. Dowd had done this walk 100 times. German naval prisoners. U-boat crews mostly. Disciplined men who stood at the foot of their bunks without being asked, who answered their numbers in clean German syllables, who wore their captivity with a certain rigid pride. He moved through the first barracks without incident. Then he pushed open the door to the communal washroom at the rear of Barracks 3. A man was hanging from a rafter. A rope of braided work cord had been looped around his neck and fastened to a wooden crossbeam overhead. His feet hung 8 inches above the floor. His hands were bound behind him. He was 21 years old. His name was Werner Drechsler. He had been in the camp for less than 12 hours. To understand what happened in that washroom and why no one who heard the story could quite believe it, you have to go back to a conversation that took place in Geneva, Switzerland in the summer of 1929, when diplomats from 47 nations sat down together and tried to write a rulebook for a catastrophe they hoped would never come again. The Geneva Convention Relative to the Treatment of Prisoners of War was signed on July 27, 1929. A framework for treating the captured enemy not as property, not as a resource to be expended, but as a human being whose basic dignity the capturing nation was obligated to preserve. Under its terms, prisoners of war were entitled to adequate food and medical care. They could not be required to perform dangerous labor. They had the right to correspond with their families. They had the right to religious services. They had the right to file formal complaints through neutral inspectors from the International Red Cross. And there was one provision buried deep in the convention's interior that would matter more than anyone anticipated. Article 43. Prisoners of war were permitted to select representatives from among their own ranks. These representatives could manage the day-to-day internal affairs of prisoner compounds. They could adjudicate minor disputes. They could enforce what the convention called camp discipline. They could, within limits, govern themselves. The framers of Article 43 intended it as a safeguard, a buffer between the captured and their captors, a way to allow men to maintain some form of dignity and structure inside the wire. It made administrative sense. It made humanitarian sense. What it did not account for was what would happen if the men elected to govern a camp were not representatives of the prisoners' welfare. What it did not account for was what would happen when the ideological machinery of the Third Reich moved inside the fence alongside the men who had served it. By the spring of 1944, the United States held more than 350,000 Axis prisoners of war on its own soil. They were housed in 511 camps scattered across 46 states, in converted fairgrounds and purpose-built complexes, in the tobacco belt of North Carolina and the cattle country of Kansas, in the swamps of Louisiana and the high desert of Arizona. The experience of those early prisoners, when they understood what they had arrived in, was almost uniformly one of disbelief. A German sergeant named Kurt Pechmann, captured in Tunisia in May 1943 and transported to Camp Aliceville in Alabama, wrote a letter home that was intercepted and translated by American censors. He described the food at his first American meal: pork chops, potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, cake for dessert. He said he had not eaten that well since before the war. He said he had expected a cage and instead found something that looked, from certain angles, like a small German town with wire around it. The Geneva Convention required the camps to be run at a standard equivalent to the United States' own military facilities. Camp commanders maintained the rules. They distributed Red Cross parcels. They allowed German-language newspapers, theatrical performances, music, athletics. Prisoners worked on farms and in food processing plants, receiving 80 cents a day, the standard pay for American enlisted men under the convention's terms. It was, by any objective measure, a more comfortable captivity than most prisoners of war in the history of warfare had ever experienced. And the rule of Article 43, prisoner self-governance, was implemented at virtually every camp in the country. The Americans believed it would make their job easier. They believed that giving men the dignity of managing their own affairs would keep the camps orderly and the prisoners cooperative. They were right in most places most of the time. But Camp Papago Park was not most places. Camp Papago Park sat in the desert approximately 5 miles northeast of Phoenix, on a flat expanse of red earth surrounded by the extraordinary silence of the Sonoran Desert. By late 1943 it had been designated as the primary holding camp for captured German naval personnel, specifically the crews of U-boats sunk in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. This distinction mattered enormously. The U-boat service was not simply a branch of the German military. It was something more concentrated, more ideologically fervent, more self-consciously elite. Submariners had endured selections and training regimens that weeded out the hesitant and the irresolute. They had operated in conditions of almost incomprehensible stress and isolation, months at sea in steel cylinders barely wider than a man's outstretched arms, where the difference between discipline and catastrophe was measured in seconds. They were, in the language of the camp administrators who processed them, hard cases. The prisoner representatives elected at Camp Papago Park were not moderates looking to make the best of a bad situation. They were committed National Socialists who viewed their captivity not as an end to their service but as a temporary interruption of it. They understood Article 43 not as a humanitarian gesture but as an opportunity. A space inside the American wire where the rules of the Reich still applied, where its hierarchy still held, where its demands still had to be met. They called themselves the Camp Court. They met in the barracks in the evenings, after the American guards had completed the last head count and withdrawn to the perimeter. They had their own procedure, their own vocabulary, their own sentences. The charge they handed down most frequently was the same charge that had sent men to German military tribunals throughout the war: defeatism, collaboration, treachery to the fatherland. Werner Drechsler was born in 1923 in a small town in Saxony in eastern Germany. His father was a railway worker. His mother kept a garden. By all surviving accounts, an ordinary boy, who thought about the future in the modest, provisional way that working-class boys of his generation were permitted to think about it before the war consumed everything. He joined the Kriegsmarine in 1940 at the age of 17 and was assigned to submarine service. He served on U-118, a Type XB mine-laying submarine operating in the Atlantic. On June 12, 1943, U-118 was caught on the surface south of the Azores by American aircraft from the escort carrier USS Bogue. The attack came in multiple passes. The submarine was badly damaged and could not dive. The order to abandon ship was given. Werner Drechsler was one of the survivors pulled from the ocean that afternoon. He was 20 years old. He had been at sea since he was 17. In the months that followed, he was debriefed by American naval intelligence officers at Fort Meade, Maryland. The specific nature and extent of what he told them remains only partially documented. What is known is that he provided information, detailed information apparently about German submarine operations, about equipment, about the communication codes and procedures that U-boat crews used to coordinate with command. He was considered cooperative by the intelligence officers who handled him. More than cooperative. He was given a new name, an alias, Oscar Jobst. By early 1944, Werner Drechsler was known within American naval intelligence as an informant. In the taxonomy of the U-boat prisoner world, there was no darker category of human being. The problem was that American naval intelligence was not always careful about managing that information. Compartmentalization was imperfect. Details about Drechsler's cooperation had traveled through channels in ways that its handlers had not fully anticipated or controlled. On March 11, 1944, Werner Drechsler was transferred from Fort Meade to Camp Papago Park, Arizona. It is not known with certainty who made that decision or why. It may have been a clerical error of the kind that large bureaucracies generate invisibly. It may have been a failure of communication between the intelligence section and the camp administration. What is known is that when Drechsler arrived at Camp Papago Park on the afternoon of March 11, someone in that receiving barracks recognized him. Not as Werner Drechsler. As the man who had talked. The word moved through the camp in hours. The 7 men who were later convicted of Drechsler's murder were all U-boat men. They ranged in age from 19 to 28. They did not deny what they had done. What emerged in the investigation and subsequent trial was a picture of something that had been operating inside Camp Papago Park, and to varying degrees inside dozens of similar facilities across the United States for months. The camp court held sessions that were, in their formal structure, almost a parody of due process. A charge was read. The accused was permitted, occasionally, to respond. Witnesses could be called. The judges, they called themselves judges, not guards, not enforcers, deliberated. A sentence was determined. The sentences followed a hierarchy recognizable to any German serviceman who had lived under military law. Admonishment, warning, formal censure, social ostracism, physical punishment, and for the gravest offenses, the offense of deliberate betrayal of comrades to the enemy, death. American camp commanders had noticed, vaguely, that certain prisoners at certain facilities seemed to live in fear of other prisoners. A man found with broken fingers. A man discovered in the infirmary with bruises that matched no accident report. A man who requested transfer to another facility and could not explain why. Individual commanders had flagged these patterns to their superiors. The reports entered a system that was, in the spring of 1944, still learning what it was dealing with. The Article 43 provision, the rule that had seemed so reasonable in Geneva in 1929, had created a shadow government inside the wire. And the shadow government had brought its courts, its ideology, and its lethal understanding of what loyalty required with it across the Atlantic. The Geneva Convention had not anticipated the Wehrmacht. It had not anticipated the political training programs that the German military embedded in its units. It had not anticipated the way a decade of systematic ideological conditioning could persist in men who had been removed from the war, who were fed and housed and clothed by a nation that wished them no particular harm. When a German prisoner at Camp Hearn in Texas was beaten so badly by fellow prisoners that he required hospitalization, the camp commander conducted an investigation and found that the men responsible explained their actions with calm directness. He had expressed doubt that Germany would win the war. He had been tried by the camp court, convicted of defeatism and sentenced. The court had simply carried out its decision. They regarded the American commander's investigation as an intervention in their internal legal proceedings, which the convention explicitly protected from interference. The American commander read Article 43 again. He read it twice. He wrote a memorandum to his superiors explaining what he had found and asked for guidance on how to reconcile the convention's protection of prisoner self-governance with the fact that the self-governance apparatus in his camp was functioning as an instrument of political terror. The guidance that came back acknowledged the problem. It did not solve it. This was not a failure of individual commanders. It was a structural failure built into the framework itself. The men who had drafted Article 43 in 1929 had been thinking about a different kind of prisoner, a different kind of war, a different relationship between soldier and state. They had imagined men who, once captured, understood themselves to be outside the conflict. Who accepted, however reluctantly, that their war was over. They had not imagined men for whom the war never stopped. Who understood every moment of captivity as a continuation of service. Who saw the wire fence not as a boundary but as a challenge, and the enemy not as a keeper but as a target. The Americans running the camps had followed the rule. They had implemented Article 43 in good faith. They had extended to their prisoners the dignity of self-governance because the convention said it was the right thing to do. And in doing so, they had handed the hardest, most ideologically committed men in the German military the tool they needed to maintain their authority over everyone in the compound. The investigation into Werner Drechsler's death began within hours of the discovery of the body. The FBI was called in. Military intelligence dispatched a team from Washington. The camp was placed on lockdown. Prisoners were interviewed individually in English and German, by interrogators who understood both the language and something of what they were dealing with. The 7 men who had carried out the sentence came forward without significant pressure. They did not regard what they had done as murder in any sense that required concealment. They had carried out a legal proceeding, they said. A court had determined a sentence. The sentence had been executed. Under the laws that governed them, they had done nothing wrong. One of them told his American interrogator that he was prepared to accept whatever the Americans chose to do with him. He said he had done his duty. He appeared to mean it. The investigation into the Drechsler case was not conducted in isolation. It was part of something larger that had been building for months in the files of the Prisoner of War Division in Washington, as individual reports from individual camps began to accumulate into a pattern that could no longer be managed as a series of separate incidents. By the spring of 1944, at least 9 German prisoners of war had been killed by fellow German prisoners at camps on American soil. The number may have been higher. Some deaths recorded as accidents or suicides were, in the retrospective light of the Drechsler investigation, reconsidered. At Camp Hearn in Texas, a prisoner named Johann Kunz had been beaten to death on November 4, 1943, by a group of fellow prisoners who accused him of reporting the activities of a secret Nazi organization to camp authorities. Kunz had been dragged from his bunk in the night, struck with a coal shovel and left on the floor. When guards found him the next morning, they treated it as a discipline problem. The prisoner representatives had handled it. The larger discovery was about control. About who actually controlled the prisoner compounds at the most fundamental level, which was not the American camp commanders at all. General Archer Lurch, the Army's Provost Marshal General, received reports throughout the spring and summer of 1944 describing camps where Nazi organizations operated openly under the cover of the self-governance provision. Where elections for prisoner representatives were conducted under conditions no honest observer would recognize as free. Where men who expressed anti-Nazi views were systematically isolated, denied privileges and threatened. He visited camps. He talked to commanders. He talked to prisoners through interpreters in sessions arranged to give as much reassurance as possible that what they said would be protected. He assembled an understanding of the situation that was, by late summer 1944, comprehensive enough to require a response. The first response was practical. Prisoner representatives would still be elected as the convention required, but camp courts would face tighter regulation. Intelligence screening for transferred prisoners would be strengthened, with specific protocols for anyone who had served as an intelligence source, who would under no circumstances be sent to camps holding former members of their own units. The second response was legal. The United States Army would prosecute the murderers of Werner Drechsler. The trial was held at Camp Papago Park itself. 7 defendants. American prosecutors. A military commission convened for the purpose. German military defense lawyers were assigned. The defense argument was not without a certain terrible logic. The 7 men argued that they had acted under the authority of the camp court, established under Article 43 of the Geneva Convention that the United States had implemented and was obligated to honor. Werner Drechsler had been tried and found guilty of collaboration with the enemy. The sentence they had carried out was not murder but a lawful military execution. The commission listened carefully. Then it rejected the argument entirely. The camp court was not a legally constituted military tribunal. It had no authority to impose capital sentences. The fact that its authority was derived, however distortedly, from a provision of the Geneva Convention did not retroactively transform murder into execution. Werner Drechsler had not been given notice of the charges against him. He had not been permitted to speak in his own defense. He had been killed in a shower room in a foreign country that had extended him the protection of its laws. All 7 were found guilty of murder. All 7 were sentenced to death. While these 7 men awaited disposition of their sentences, the wider story of what had happened in the camps was surfacing in American public consciousness. Congressional interest was aroused, partly because of the Drechsler case and partly because of a parallel development that cut in an entirely different direction. A number of American citizens, mostly in the southern states, had begun writing to their representatives expressing concern not that the POW camps were dangerous, but that they were too comfortable, too generous, too aligned with the convention's requirements in ways that struck these letter writers as insulting to American soldiers fighting overseas. Their specific grievances were, in some cases, almost surreal in their particularity. German prisoners of war in camps in Alabama and Texas and Georgia were permitted to eat at the lunch counters of the towns where they worked on labor details. African American soldiers returning from the same front where those German prisoners had been captured were not. The Jim Crow laws governing public accommodations in the American South did not distinguish between enemy prisoners and American citizens. They distinguished between white and black. The German prisoners were white. They had the right. African American soldiers who had fought and bled in North Africa and Italy, who returned to American soil in their uniforms, had to enter through the back door of the same establishment where their former enemies could sit at the counter and order coffee. The camp commanders who observed this phenomenon were not men who controlled the civilian laws of the states in which their camps were located. They were operating a system that the Geneva Convention required them to run at a certain standard, and they ran it at that standard, and in doing so they created a situation that the drafters of the convention, working in Geneva in 1929, had never imagined. The specific architecture of American racial oppression was not something they had been designing around. But the men and women who lived in that architecture could see it with perfect clarity. The rule designed to protect human dignity was operating, in the specific context of the Jim Crow South, as a mechanism that conferred more practical rights on captured enemies of the United States than on its own citizens. It was a contradiction that many in authority found impossible to address. Many did not address it at all. On August 25, 1945, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, all 7 men convicted in the Drechsler case were hanged. They were not the only German prisoners executed for murdering fellow prisoners. In separate proceedings, German prisoners convicted in the Coons case at Camp Hearn were also put to death. By the time the military prison at Leavenworth completed its work on these cases, it had executed more German prisoners of war for the murder of other German prisoners of war than any other facility in the history of modern warfare. The war in Europe had ended 3 months earlier. Germany had surrendered. The Third Reich, in whose name the camp court had conducted its proceedings and issued its sentences, had ceased to exist. This fact did not alter the legal situation of the 7 men. They went to the scaffold without public fanfare. No newspaper photographers. No official statements beyond the terse notifications that accompanied any military execution. It was, in its way, a quiet ending to a story built out of noise, the noise of ideology, of certainty, of men so thoroughly persuaded of the rightness of their cause that they could walk into a shower room in the middle of an Arizona night and carry out a death sentence against a sleeping man and describe the act, afterward, without flinching, as a duty performed. The repatriation of German prisoners of war from the United States began in the spring of 1946 and continued through 1947. More than 400,000 men had been held in the American camp system. The vast majority were returned to Germany in good health, considerably better fed than the German civilian population they were returning to, many having acquired practical skills, English language ability, and a set of impressions about the United States that they carried with them for the rest of their lives. What they carried was complicated. Many of them wrote about it afterward. Their accounts fill the archives of universities and historical institutes in Germany, personal memoirs and letters and depositions given to researchers who spent the second half of the 20th century trying to understand what the experience had meant. Some remembered the food and the baseball games in the libraries. They remembered American guards who treated them with a rough, impersonal decency they had not expected. They remembered the shock of seeing the physical abundance of the country, the supermarkets and the highways in the distances, the sheer scale of a nation that had apparently had everything it needed before the war and now had even more. A few wrote honestly about the camp's darker interior life, about what had operated inside the barracks in the evenings, about the fear that some of them had lived with. The careful attention required to say nothing that could be reported to the court. To give no sign of doubt. To perform loyalty with sufficient conviction that no one would look at you the way they had looked at Werner Drechsler when he stepped off the transfer bus from Fort Meade. One man, a former petty officer from a Type 7 U-boat, described the experience of those evening sessions in the barracks with a specificity that was clearly drawn from memory that had never fully released him. He said the room would get very quiet when someone was being discussed. You learn to be still, he said. To keep your face without expression. He paused and then he said, I have asked myself for 30 years whether I believed. Whether I was simply afraid or whether I believed too, and was saved from what they did only by the accident of never being required to prove it. He said he did not have an answer. The official record of the American POW camp system, as compiled in the years after the war, describes a program that was, on balance, a successful implementation of the Geneva Convention. The camps were well run. Conditions were adequate. Abuse was limited, documented, and prosecuted when it occurred. The record is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. What it captures is the surface of the system as it was designed to operate. What it does not capture is the interior life of that system, the world that existed inside the barracks after head count, after the American guards had checked their watches and withdrawn to the perimeter, after the lights in the camp towers had settled into their steady, distant intervals. The men who ran the camp courts understood something that the American commanders for the most part did not. They understood that the rules governing the system from outside the wire were only as effective as the authority that existed inside it. And inside the wire, they had built something that the Geneva Convention had inadvertently made possible. A jurisdiction. A sovereignty. A small, iron-fenced country where the war was still being fought and its laws still held and the penalty for certain kinds of speech was still death. The American commanders had believed in the rule. They had implemented it carefully and in good faith. They had extended to their prisoners a degree of self-determination that was, by any historical standard, unusual and generous. They had done what the convention asked of them. But a rule is not an idea. The rule is a tool. And the purpose it serves depends entirely on the hands that hold it. Werner Drechsler was buried in the German prisoner of war cemetery at Fort Douglas, Utah, under a white wooden cross that carried his name and the dates of his brief life. 1923 to 1944. In the years after the war, the cemetery was maintained as the Americans' obligations to fallen prisoners required. The grounds were kept. The grass was cut. The crosses were repainted when they needed it. For decades almost no one came. The families of the 7 executed men were notified in official correspondence. The bodies were eventually repatriated to Germany and reburied in German military cemeteries. Their names are on the stones. There is no indication on those stones of the manner of their deaths or of the proceedings that preceded them. At Camp Papago Park, the land was eventually incorporated into what is now the Phoenix Zoo and a city park. Families walk there on weekend mornings. Children run on the grass where Barracks 3 stood. The desert light falls on the red earth the same way it did in March of 1944, flat and bright and utterly indifferent. In 1984, a historian named Arnold Kramer published a comprehensive account of the German prisoner of war experience in America. His research was the first serious attempt to bring the full scope of the story into a single frame. He documented the scale of the camp system, the conditions, the generosity and the failures. He documented the camp courts, the murders, the trials, the executions. He also documented something that had received almost no attention in the available literature: the testimony of men who had lived under the authority of the camp courts and survived. Their accounts described a form of captivity that was, in its external features, notably comfortable by the standards of wartime imprisonment, and in its internal reality, something considerably darker. Men who had been afraid for months, sometimes years. Who had calculated every word before speaking it. Who had learned to read the temperature of a room with the particular precision that only people who live with a serious threat develop. Who had done this not in a dungeon or a gulag but in clean American barracks, with adequate food in a baseball field outside the window and the mountains visible on clear days. Kramer noted in his conclusion that the experience seemed to confirm something the Geneva Convention's framers might have noticed if they had been attending to the right details in 1929. Rules protect people from external harm with some reliability. They are much less effective at protecting people from the harm that their own comrades, in the grip of sufficient certainty, are prepared to do to them. The convention had not found a way around that. No convention had, then or since. In a letter written from Camp Aliceville, Alabama, in January 1944, and preserved in the archives of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, a German prisoner named Hans Berger, an ordinary Wehrmacht corporal from Saxony captured in Tunisia, wrote to his mother about a conversation he had overheard between 2 American guards. He could not understand all of it. His English was limited. But he understood enough. One of the guards had been complaining about a rule. Some regulation that seemed to him excessive, or simply difficult. The other guard had shrugged and said something that Berger wrote down in his letter carefully in German, because he wanted to remember it. The other guard said, "That's the rule. The rule doesn't care how you feel about it. Berger wrote that he had thought about this for days. He wrote that in Germany before the war he had always assumed that rules were made by people, and that rules therefore reflected what people thought was right, and that if enough people thought differently rules could change. The war had altered this belief considerably. But hearing the American guard say what he said, he found himself turning it over in his mind. The rule doesn't care how you feel about it. He wrote that there was something honest in the statement. Something he recognized. He wrote that the question he kept returning to was not whether the rule cared, but whether the people who made the rule had thought carefully enough about who would be living under it. He signed the letter and folded it and placed it in the small paper envelope the camp post office provided. He was 23 years old. He had not been in front of the camp court. He had kept his expressions carefully neutral. He had survived. He mailed the letter and walked back across the Alabama earth to his barracks, and the rule continued to apply to him, and the men for whom it had not been designed continued to meet in the evenings, and somewhere in Arizona a young sailor lay in the grave that had been prepared for him, under a white cross that no one was coming to visit. The desert was quiet the way deserts are. With the particular quietness of places that have absorbed a great deal and kept it without comment, under the open sky, in the long light of afternoon, while the world continued making its rules and believing, against the evidence, that the rules were enough. In all, at least 10 German prisoners of war were murdered by fellow German prisoners on American soil during World War II. 7 men were executed by the United States Army for the murder of Werner Drechsler at Camp Papago Park, Arizona. Werner Drechsler was 21 years old. He had been inside the camp for less than 12 hours. The Geneva Convention remains in force.